Margaret Sullivan adjusted her simple black dress and clutched her purse tighter as she walked through the gates of Marine Corps Base Quantico. The Virginia sun beat down mercilessly on the parade ground where hundreds of families had gathered for the graduation ceremony. She felt out of place among the proud military families, many dressed in their finest clothes, some wearing military pins and ribbons that spoke of generations of service. Margaret was different. She was a single mother from a small town in Ohio, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Her son Michael had always been her entire world, and today he was graduating from Marine Corps Officer Candidate School. She had saved for months to afford the trip to Virginia, staying in the cheapest motel she could find, and driving her old Honda Civic instead of flying. The ceremony was magnificent. Hundreds of newly commissioned officers stood in perfect formation, their dress blue uniforms pristine under the afternoon sun. Margaret's eyes searched the ranks until she found Michael, standing tall and proud in the 3rd row. Her heart swelled with emotions she couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly, but also a deep sadness that seemed to come from somewhere she tried never to visit in her memories. As families began to find their seats in the bleachers, Margaret chose a spot toward the back. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. She had learned long ago that blending in was safer than standing out. Her simple clothes and worn purse made her feel like an intruder in this world of military tradition and family legacy. Captain James Rodriguez was making his routine walk through the family seating area when something caught his eye. A woman sitting alone in the back row had shifted in her seat, and the sleeve of her dress had ridden up slightly, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo on her forearm. Something about the design made him pause mid-step. Captain Rodriguez had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. He had seen enough tattoos to fill a book, but this one was different. Even from his limited view, he could make out what looked like military insignia, but not the kind that civilians usually got. This looked official, earned, meaningful. Margaret noticed the captain staring and quickly pulled her sleeve down, a gesture that had become automatic over the years. She had learned to keep the tattoo hidden, especially in situations like this where questions might arise. Questions she wasn't ready to answer, questions that brought back memories she had spent 15 years trying to forget. The captain continued his duties, but his mind kept returning to that brief glimpse of ink on the woman's arm. Something about her entire demeanor spoke to him as well. The way she held herself, the way she scanned the area with awareness that seemed almost tactical, the way she positioned herself with clear sight lines to multiple exits. These were habits that civilians didn't typically develop. During the ceremony, Margaret watched with tears in her eyes as Michael was called forward to receive his commission. When he saluted the reviewing officer, she remembered another young person who had saluted with the same pride and determination. The memory hit her like a physical blow, and she had to grip the bleacher seat to steady herself. Captain Rodriguez was positioned where he could observe the crowd, and he noticed the woman's reaction to the salute. Her face had gone pale, and her knuckles were white as she gripped the bench. This wasn't just the emotional response of a proud mother. This was something deeper, something that spoke of personal experience with military protocol and tradition. When the formal ceremony concluded and families began to rush onto the field to congratulate their newly commissioned officers, Margaret hung back. She watched from a distance as other families embraced their sons and daughters, took photos, and celebrated. She wanted to give Michael his moment without her complicated presence overshadowing his achievement. Michael broke away from the crowd and jogged toward her, his face beaming with joy. When he reached her, he swept her into a fierce hug that lifted her feet off the ground. In that moment, Margaret forgot about everything else. This was her son, her baby who had grown into a strong, honorable man, and he had just achieved something remarkable. "Mom, I can't believe you made it," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. I know how hard it was for you to get here. Margaret smiled through her tears. I wouldn't have missed this for anything in the world. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. As they embraced, Captain Rodriguez approached them. He had been watching the reunion, and something about the family dynamic continued to intrigue him. The young lieutenant seemed protective of his mother in a way that suggested he understood she carried burdens that others might not see. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Sullivan," Captain Rodriguez said as he approached. Michael immediately snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." "Congratulations on your commission. I wanted to meet your family," the captain said, his eyes moving between Michael and Margaret. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She had hoped to get through the day without drawing any attention from military personnel. She knew how observant they could be, how quickly they could piece together details that civilians might miss. "Thank you, sir. This is my mother, Margaret Sullivan," Michael said proudly. Captain Rodriguez extended his hand to Margaret, and she shook it briefly. His handshake was firm and professional, but she noticed how his eyes seemed to be studying her, not in an inappropriate way, but with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sullivan. You must be very proud," Captain Rodriguez said. "I am," Margaret replied simply, hoping the conversation would end there. But Captain Rodriguez didn't move away. Instead, he seemed to be considering something, his eyes occasionally flicking to her forearm where her sleeve covered the tattoo. Margaret felt the familiar anxiety rising in her chest. She had become an expert at reading people over the years, and she could see that this captain was suspicious about something. Her instincts, honed by years of hypervigilance, were telling her to leave immediately. "Michael, we should probably get going," she said quietly. "I have a long drive back to Ohio." But Captain Rodriguez spoke up again. "Mrs. Sullivan, forgive me for asking, but have we met before? You seem familiar somehow." Margaret's blood ran cold. This was exactly what she had hoped to avoid. Margaret felt her heart racing as Captain Rodriguez continued to study her face. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge she wasn't ready to accept. Michael looked between his mother and the captain, sensing tension he didn't understand. "I don't think so, sir," Margaret replied carefully, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I'm just here for my son's graduation." Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Years of military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and everything about this woman triggered his sense that there was more to her story than she was sharing. "Mom worked really hard to be here today," Michael interjected, perhaps sensing his mother's discomfort. "She's been saving up for months to make the trip." The captain's expression softened slightly at the young man's obvious love and protection for his mother. "That's wonderful. Family support means everything to a new officer." Margaret managed a small smile, hoping the conversation was ending. But then a gust of wind caught her sleeve, pushing it up her arm just enough to reveal more of the tattoo underneath. This time, Captain Rodriguez got a clearer look, and his entire demeanor changed. What he saw wasn't just any military tattoo, it was specific, detailed, and represented something that made his breath catch in his throat. The design included elements that only someone with very particular military experience would have earned the right to wear permanently on their skin. Margaret noticed his reaction immediately and quickly pulled her sleeve back down, but it was too late. The captain had seen enough to confirm what his instincts had been telling him. "Mrs. Sullivan," Captain Rodriguez said quietly, his tone now carrying a different weight. "Would you mind if I spoke with you privately for a moment?" Michael looked confused and slightly protective. "Sir, is there a problem?" "No problem at all, Lieutenant. I just have some questions for your mother, if she doesn't mind." Margaret felt trapped. Running away would only create more questions, and she could see that Captain Rodriguez was not going to let this go. After 15 years of hiding, it seemed her past was finally catching up with her. "Michael, Why don't you go find your friends and take some pictures? Margaret said softly. I'll catch up with you in a few minutes. Michael hesitated, clearly wanting to protect his mother from whatever was troubling her. But ultimately, he respected her request and walked away, though he kept glancing back at them. Captain Rodriguez waited until they were alone before speaking again. Ma'am, I need to ask you directly. Are you a veteran? Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly, as if she had been carrying a heavy weight for years and was finally setting it down. Yes, she said quietly. What branch? Marine Corps. Captain Rodriguez felt his suspicions confirmed, but now he was even more intrigued. Female Marines were relatively rare, especially ones who would have served long enough to earn the kind of tattoo he had glimpsed, and her age suggested she would have served during some of the most intense years of recent military conflicts. What years? He asked gently. 2001 to 2009, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine. Those were the years that defined his generation of Marines, the years of Iraq and Afghanistan, of deployment after deployment, of losses that shaped everyone who served during that time. Were you deployed? Margaret nodded. 3 times, twice to Iraq, once to Afghanistan. The captain studied her face more carefully now, looking past the tired single-mother facade to see the Marine underneath. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see it clearly. The way she stood with perfect posture despite trying to appear small, the way her eyes constantly scanned for threats, the way she positioned herself with tactical awareness. What was your MOS? He asked, using the military term for job specialty. Margaret hesitated for a long moment before answering. Military police? Captain Rodriguez felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Female MPs during those years had seen some of the most dangerous assignments. They had been involved in convoy security, prisoner operations, and some of the most intense combat operations of the wars. Why didn't you tell your son? He asked softly. This was the question Margaret had been dreading for years. She looked across the field where Michael was laughing with his new fellow officers, so proud and eager to serve his country. How could she explain to him that she had once worn the same uniform with the same pride, only to have it all ripped away from her in the worst possible way? Because I'm not the kind of Marine he should look up to, she said finally. Captain Rodriguez was taken aback by her response. Ma'am, with all due respect, that's not for you to decide. Any Marine who served during those years, especially with multiple deployments, deserves respect and recognition. Margaret shook her head. You don't understand. I didn't leave the Corps with honor. I was medically discharged. The captain waited for her to continue, sensing there was much more to the story. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself to share details she had kept buried for years. My last deployment was Afghanistan, 2008. I was leading a convoy security team when we hit an IED. 3 Marines died that day. Good Marines, young Marines with families waiting for them at home. Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. I survived, but I was injured, not just physically. When I came back, I couldn't handle it anymore. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the guilt. I started drinking to cope. Eventually, they had no choice but to discharge me. Captain Rodriguez felt his heart sink as he listened to her story. He had seen too many good Marines struggle with the invisible wounds of war, only to be misunderstood and stigmatized for their struggles. Ma'am, that doesn't make you any less of a Marine, he said firmly. That makes you a casualty of war, just like the Marines who were physically wounded. Margaret wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to maintain composure. I've spent the last 15 years trying to rebuild my life. When Michael said he wanted to join the Marines, I was terrified. How could I tell him that his mother was a broken Marine who couldn't even make it through her full enlistment? Because you're not broken, Captain Rodriguez said with conviction. You're a survivor. You raised a son who became a Marine officer. Do you have any idea how remarkable that is? Margaret looked across the field again at Michael, who was now posing for photos with his platoon. He doesn't know about any of it. He thinks I was just a secretary or something civilian. I never wanted him to know that his mother was a failure. Captain Rodriguez felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. This woman had sacrificed everything for her country, paid a price that most people couldn't imagine, and then spent years believing she was somehow less worthy because she had been wounded in ways that weren't visible. Mrs. Sullivan, he said carefully, what if I told you that your son deserves to know the truth about his mother? And what if I told you that the Marine Corps owes you recognition for your service that was never properly given? Margaret looked at him with confusion and fear. What do you mean? Captain Rodriguez glanced around to make sure they were still speaking privately. Ma'am, I've been reviewing records of Marines who served during those years, especially those who were medically discharged for PTSD. Many of them never received the recognition they deserved because the military didn't understand these injuries at the time. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I think it's time for that to change. Margaret stared at Captain Rodriguez in disbelief. After years of feeling like she had failed as a Marine, the idea that anyone in the Corps might want to recognize her service seemed impossible. I don't understand, she said quietly. What kind of recognition? I was discharged. I didn't complete my enlistment. I let my Marines down. Captain Rodriguez shook his head firmly. Ma'am, you didn't let anyone down. You led Marines in combat, you survived an enemy attack, and you dealt with wounds that the military didn't know how to treat properly at the time. That's not failure. That's sacrifice. Before Margaret could respond, Michael appeared at her side, having noticed his mother's distressed expression from across the field. Mom, is everything okay? He asked, looking concerned as he glanced between his mother and the captain. Margaret felt panic rise in her throat. She wasn't ready for this conversation, especially not here, not now, on what was supposed to be Michael's day of triumph. Captain Rodriguez seemed to sense her internal struggle. Lieutenant Sullivan, would you mind if your mother and I continued our conversation? There's something important we need to discuss. Michael looked at his mother questioningly. Margaret could see the worry in his eyes, the same protective instinct he had shown since he was a little boy. She realized that her attempts to shield him from her past had only made him more anxious about her well-being. Actually, Margaret said, surprising herself with her decision, I think you should hear this too, Michael. Captain Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Lieutenant, your mother is a combat veteran. She served with distinction as a military police officer during some of the most dangerous years of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, and then something that looked like awe. Mom, you were a Marine? Margaret nodded, tears now flowing freely. I served from 2001 to 2009, 3 deployments. I never told you because... She struggled to find the words. Because I didn't leave the way I wanted to. I was medically discharged after my last deployment. Why didn't you tell me? Michael's voice was soft, not accusatory, but filled with hurt that she had kept such an important part of herself hidden from him. Because I was ashamed, Margaret admitted. I thought, if you knew your mother was a Marine who couldn't finish her service, you might think less of me, or worse, that it might discourage you from pursuing your own military career. Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Then he stepped forward and pulled his mother into another fierce embrace. Mom, you're the strongest person I know. You raised me by yourself, worked multiple jobs, and never once complained. If you did all of that while dealing with combat wounds, that doesn't make you weak. That makes you a hero. Captain Rodriguez watched the emotional reunion and then cleared his throat gently. If I may interrupt, I have a proposal. Both Margaret and Michael turned to look at him. "Mrs. Sullivan, I would like to recommend you for a medal that should have been awarded years ago. Your service record shows that you were involved in multiple combat operations, saved lives during convoy attacks, and maintained unit cohesion under extreme circumstances. The fact that you were wounded in service to your country entitles you to recognition, not shame." Margaret wiped her eyes, still struggling to believe what she was hearing. "Captain, I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't need any medals. I just want my son to understand why I never talked about it." "With respect, ma'am, this isn't just about you," Captain Rodriguez replied. "There are hundreds of Marines like you who came home wounded in ways we couldn't see, who were discharged without proper recognition, and who have been carrying shame they don't deserve. Someone needs to be first. Someone needs to show that the Corps acknowledges these invisible wounds as legitimate combat injuries." Michael looked at his mother with new understanding. "Mom, that's why you always seem to know so much about military stuff. That's why you never asked questions about my training or worried about me the way other mothers did. You understood what I was going through because you had been there yourself." Margaret nodded. "I was terrified when you said you wanted to be a Marine, not because I don't respect the Corps, but because I knew what it could cost you. What it cost me. But look what it gave you too," Michael said softly. "It made you strong enough to raise me, tough enough to survive anything, and honorable enough to hide your own pain so I could pursue my dreams without feeling guilty about your sacrifices." Captain Rodriguez pulled out his phone. "Mrs. Sullivan, would you permit me to make some calls? I have contacts who work with veteran recognition programs. I believe we can arrange for a proper ceremony to acknowledge your service." Margaret looked uncertain. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of attention." "You don't have to decide right now," the captain said. "But I want you to know that your service mattered. The Marines you lost in that IED attack, their sacrifice was meaningful because of leaders like you who cared enough about them to carry their memory for all these years." For the first time in 15 years, Margaret felt a small crack in the wall of guilt and shame she had built around her military experience. Maybe, she thought, it was possible to honor her fallen Marines while also acknowledging her own survival and growth. "What would this ceremony involve?" she asked tentatively. Captain Rodriguez smiled. "It would be simple but meaningful. We would present you with the combat action ribbon you earned but never received, along with campaign medals for your deployments. More importantly, we would have your service officially recognized in front of your son and other Marines who need to see that invisible wounds don't diminish a Marine's honor." Michael squeezed his mother's hand. "Mom, I think you should do it. Not just for yourself, but for me. I want to know the whole story of the woman who raised me. I want to understand where my strength comes from." Margaret looked at her son, seeing not the little boy she had protected from her nightmares, but the strong young man who was now a commissioned officer in the same corps where she had served. She realized that her attempts to protect him from her story had actually deprived him of understanding the source of his own courage and determination. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll think about it." Captain Rodriguez handed her his business card. "Take all the time you need. When you're ready, call me. The Corps owes you this recognition, and frankly, we need other veterans to see that seeking help for combat stress is a sign of strength, not weakness." As the three of them stood together on the parade ground where Michael had just been commissioned, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not pride exactly, but perhaps the beginning of self-forgiveness. Later that evening, as Margaret and Michael sat in a small restaurant near her motel, she found herself telling him stories she had kept locked away for 15 years. Stories about the Marines she had served with, the missions they had completed, and yes, even the day that changed everything. "I think about them every day," she said, referring to the 3 Marines who died in the IED attack. "Corporal Martinez had a daughter who was born while he was deployed. Lance Corporal Thompson was saving money to buy his mother a house. Private First Class Johnson was planning to propose to his girlfriend when he got home. Michael listened quietly, understanding now why his mother had always seemed to carry an invisible weight. "But Mom," he said finally, "you survived for a reason. You came home and raised me. And now I'm a Marine too. Maybe that was part of their legacy in a way." Margaret smiled through her tears. For the first time since that terrible day in Afghanistan, she allowed herself to consider that her survival might have been meaningful rather than just random luck. 2 months later, Margaret stood in dress uniform that had been specially altered to fit her after all these years. The ceremony was small but dignified, held at a Marine Corps recruiting station in her hometown of Columbus, Ohio. Captain Rodriguez had traveled from Quantico to present her awards personally. Michael stood at her side in his dress blues, no longer just her son, but her fellow Marine. As Captain Rodriguez pinned the combat action ribbon on her uniform, Margaret felt 15 years of shame beginning to lift from her shoulders. "Semper Fi, Marine," Captain Rodriguez said as he saluted her. Margaret returned the salute with precision that surprised her. "Semper Fi, sir?" In the small crowd of local veterans and community members, she saw faces that reflected understanding rather than judgment. These were people who knew that courage sometimes meant surviving when others didn't, and that healing sometimes took longer than anyone expected. After the ceremony, a young female veteran approached Margaret. "Ma'am, thank you for doing this. I served in Iraq and I've been struggling with some of the same issues you described. Seeing you receive recognition gives me hope that I might be able to forgive myself someday too." Margaret realized then that Captain Rodriguez had been right. This wasn't just about her. It was about changing the conversation around invisible wounds and showing other veterans that their struggles didn't diminish their service. As she drove home that evening, with her medals carefully placed in a shadow box that Michael had prepared, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She was finally ready to be both the Marine she had been and the mother she had become, without shame about either identity. The tattoo on her forearm, which had been hidden for so long, now felt like what it was always meant to be. Not a mark of shame, but a badge of honor earned through service and sacrifice. And for the first time since that day in Afghanistan, Sergeant Margaret Sullivan was proud to be a Marine.